Thank you very much indeed, and I hope that everyone can hear me well. It is such an honor to be invited to share with some of my views here. And Yaroslav, thank you very much for your kind introduction, and it was such a pleasure that we met in both in the UK and also later in Ukraine last year. Maybe I can start with a little bit self-introduction, and then I will come down to talk more specifically about China-Ukrainian relations. So for me, I'm currently teaching at School of International Studies at Peking University. Before this, I was educated in the UK for my PhD, and I moved to Australia for a while to teach international relations there. For the past 7-8 years or so, my research and policy engagement particularly focus on international conflict and mediation. I've traveled to Myanmar, Venezuela, Colombia, Syria, Lebanon, and most recently Ukraine to conduct field-based research on international conflict. And I particularly pay attention to the role of China in conflict mediation and peace-building processes. So with regard to Ukraine, I'm not expert on Ukraine or on Russia. Before 2022. I have large numbers of both Ukrainian and Russian friends within China. And of course, the war that since 2022 largely changed the way that we interact with each other. And then that led me to do more research and also engagement with regard to Ukraine. So that we firstly started with a number of Ukrainian sinologists who knows China very well, in a way to promote more, you may say, neutral and also pro-Ukrainian materials within the Chinese audience. Because I know there's a war going on since 2022, but then if you look at the context of China, the amount of resources put into China by Russian and also Ukrainian actors are completely unbalanced within the Chinese audience. So you can say that probably most of the information the Chinese audience received in 2022, especially in the early stage, are actually much led by the Russian state media, which already had a strong presence in China before the war. So that is the initial work that we try to do. We try to put more resources and also news from Ukrainian sources directly into the context of China. And after that, we kind of want to open more track 2 channels between Chinese and also Ukrainian actors to make sure that both sides understood each other's position in a clear and clarified way. So that is partially the work I've been doing since the second half of 2022 until now. And then last year, I conducted a field trip to Ukraine. So I visited both Lvov, Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Odessa. I've been to, I think, within the range of where I can travel to as many places as I can in Ukraine in the time period of 1 month. And also had a very honorable and also brief meeting with President Zelensky and some of the both diplomats and also researchers based in Ukraine. So after that field trip, that I have, in a way, that written and also delivered my experience and also my views and takes on Ukraine and also Chinese position and policies on Ukraine in a more concrete and also clarified, articulated way. My fundamental view has not really changed very much since the beginning of the war, which that I think that Ukraine is fighting a war against aggressor. And I think that it has always been my view that China should adopt a more neutralized position, at least within this conflict. Nonetheless, throughout my interactions with many of my Ukrainian colleagues and also my Ukrainian friends, I do realize that there's a perception gap between, in a way, the Chinese actual policies and also that how the Ukrainian audience might perceive it. Because at least I think that what struck me a lot is that the Ukrainian public, understandably so, since 2022, perceive China as a pro-Russian actor, which to a certain extent is true. But on the other hand, when I was talking to the Ukrainian officials, I kind of realized that their understanding of the Chinese position is actually quite accurate and up to date. I'm going to explain later about China's more, you may say, complicated approach towards Ukraine and the dilemmas that China is facing for the Chinese decision makers when they're facing the Ukrainian war. So there's several kind of questions which I'm going to discuss, and Yaroslav sent me a long list of questions that he wanted me to address in the 45 minutes presentation, which I cannot cover completely. But I think some of the questions are in a way linked to those major questions which I'm going to address. So the first question I want to elaborate is that what are Chinese government position and reactions towards the Ukrainian war since 2022? So there's a longer period since 2014, but I will specifically focus on the Chinese reactions, the governmental reactions since 2022. In February 2022, I think the Chinese decision makers and also the Chinese Foreign Ministry was actually experienced the initial shock by the event. There are a lot of research and also analysis seem to suggest that China was informed before Russia's military aggression. But at that time and until now, I can right now probably comfortably say that there is a little evidence to suggest the Chinese top leadership was informed about the scale of this military campaign. In fact, that started in February 2022. There is certainly throughout all my interactions, all my communication, there is no evidence to suggest that China was informed, at least not to this scale. So Chinese decision makers were very shocked to learn about this. And this is also a reason why that they kind of realized that because shortly before the invasion, in a lot of official exchanges, the Chinese government say that there's no limit to the China-Russia partnership, which I think right now, if you look retrospectively, this is probably led by the Russian actor to say that and to announce that. And the Chinese actors will feel that to caught in such a dilemma after February 2022, which seemed to be, because the announcement, if you look at that at times, seemed to be indicate that China is supportive of Russian actors. So that was the initial shock in February 2022. And I think that from about March 2022 to February 2023, within this 1 year period, the Chinese government is basically doing a wait and see policy. It wants to see, first of all, the Western responses, both from the Europe and also from the United States. It wants to see whether the European Union is unified towards Ukraine and also towards Russia. Because if we remember it, at the very initial stage, in the first 1 month or so, there was this kind of moment where that the European actors has really not formed a really firm opinion to what extent they want to support Ukraine. So Chinese actors at the same time is waiting to see the reactions from the European actors and also from the United States. And also you also want to see to what extent the Ukraine is firm in its resistance and capable of resisting the Russian aggression, and whether this case will look like 2014 or from 2014 to 2022, this period of, you may say, military confrontation and escalation. And it's also want to see Russian resilience, to what extent that the Russian actors can withhold itself from the Western sanctions and also pressures, and from the potential military defeat and difficulties on the battlefield. And also want to see the reactions from the global South. So from this whole year, China is waiting to see the reactions from every side to form its actual policy position on the Ukrainian war. And since February 2023, after this 1 year of invasion, you can see that China has a relatively stable policy stance, which lasted from that time until now, which is that China will have a limited involvement in the Ukrainian war. China will uphold this peace position, which is advocate for a political solution, so to speak, to the war. And China will not align particularly with any side in this conflict. I know this position might sound very suspicious and questionable for some of the Ukrainian colleagues, but I'm going to explain to you later on about the very details of this position. So what we can observe from February 2023 is there some kind of actions from the Chinese side. China announced a 12-point peace deal, which was not very well received in Ukraine, understandably so. And in April, that President Xi had a call with President Zelensky. In May, that China sent out its special envoy, Li Hui, which was the ex-Russian ambassador of China to Russia. I can talk a little bit more about why Li Hui was chosen. This seemed to be a really weird choice to select ex-Russian ambassador, ex-ambassador to Russia as the special envoy on the Ukrainian war. But there's a logic behind it. So Li Hui visited Ukraine last May, and then in July 2023, that China announced the restrictions on the exportation of drones, right? So there's several steps there, which that you can clearly see there's a shift and more clarified Chinese position since last February. And that was also the context where I start to plan my field trip to Ukraine, which I think that my visit to Ukraine will not trigger a lot of, in a way, strong resistance from the officials or from the government anymore in China. And the motivations behind this change, from my own judgment, I think that is mainly driven by the thinkings to save that China's international image and also to improve China's relationship both with Ukraine and also with the European partners. Yet that after China changed its position to a more, you may say, neutralized, a pro-peace position, China also realized that there's not much China can do at this stage. Because China, after communicating with both sides, realized that there's no clear willingness from either side to engage in peace talks. And China's approach to conflict mediation has always been a strongly facilitated oriented approach, which means that China wants the guarantee from the conflicting parties to express their willingness to engage in peace talks before China is getting engaged in the processes. China does not want to be seen as pressure anyone, either Ukrainian or Russian, into peace negotiations. So even China changed its position, China has do some more, you may say, positive moves since February 2023, but then it very quickly China realized that within the current situation, there's a little China can do, and China will not push any actors into the negotiation at this very stage. Okay, so if we want to summarize China's current position in a way, clarified way, it's not the official rhetoric way. I think that you can more or less summarize it in 3 points. One point is that you can find that statement basically since 2022 already, that China will respect the Ukrainian border since 1991. That is the almost in all the statement you can see that China respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty. And when asked about what does this mean, that China specifically said that this is basically means the post-1991 border of Ukrainian territory. The second position is that China reject what we say that the security blocks, which refers to NATO, because China believes that the existence of security blocks in Europe might have a very similar reaction or phenomenon in East Asia, which will create such a security threat to China itself. So China essentially, before the conflict, has always had the very firm position of rejecting NATO. This is also related. This is a very, very long history since 1950s, but there has been a long kind of time of trouble China had with NATO since the very beginning, related to Taiwan, related to South North Korea, and also most recently in 1999 related to China's like the death of the China's embassy staff in Belgrade. So that is a position number 2. Is the rejection of security blocks as in a way like the security solution and security architecture for sustainable peace solutions. And thirdly, it's about advocate for ceasefire and political solution. This has been repeated for many times, which I don't think I need to elaborate anymore. Okay. So behind those kind of official positions, I think there are clear red lines right now being articulated by China. The first one, which I think is the most important one, which I think is also the one that's probably need to be explained to my Ukrainian colleagues in a very kind of a clear way, is that China's right now, there's a clear red lines that China will not sell arms to either side in the conflict, which does not include the weapons obtained through third parties. So both Ukrainian side and Russian side have been obtaining Chinese in a way that's no Chinese weapon directly, but then Chinese supplies, which can be in a way used in the battlefield through third parties. This is something that the Chinese government cannot enforce and stop. But the Chinese governmental position has been very clear, I think, and this comes directly from the top leadership, is that China will not sell arms to either side. So this is why that you can see, despite there are accusations of China supplying weapons to Russia since the very beginning, those accusations may resurface in the international media for some time and then disappear again. If you imagine the amount of attention that's been paid to Chinese policies from the international media and also from the government, if there's even one case of clear evidence to suggest China has been supplying weapons to Russia, this will be, well reported and will be regarded as China's change of policy position since 2022. But so far that we have seen no firm accusations or evidence to suggest that China has a policy of supplying weapons to either side, and particularly not to Russia. And this is not a part that Russia is particularly happy about. Russian delegations who have been to China specifically said that, before the war that we have been doing so many kind of joint military drills and cooperations. But then since the war, that China basically stopped all of the military cooperation with Russia. And this is not the part that the Russian counterpart is actually happy about. And when some of the European officials ask the Chinese officials whether China is supplying weapons to Russia, there is once that I think one of the Chinese diplomats responded, which is very accurately so, that he said that if China decides to supply weapons to Russia, the war will be very different, which is very true. So that the amount of the Chinese military capacity and what it can be used on the battlefield will fundamentally change the war. So I think there's a clear guarantee that China has delivered both to Ukrainian and also to Russian actors that China is not going to sell weapons to either side in this battlefield. And even for military uniforms, China have a very strict policy of not even exporting military uniforms to the Russian battlefield. So that is the first red line. The second red line is that no use of nuclear weapons of threat. And this has been delivered, I think, very clearly by the Chinese leadership to the Russian leadership. And many people will feel that it was because of the resistance from both India and Russia on the nuclear weapons or use of nuclear threat that the Russian leadership is in a way withholding the use of the nuclear threat continuously in the battlefield. Although I think it's debatable, because I think fundamentally China cannot really restrict the use of the nuclear weapons if Russia decided to go ahead. Okay, but that is the red line for China very clearly, is that no use of nuclear weapons of threat. So those are the two, I think, red lines from China, which has been delivered very clearly, I think, to all the conflict parties involved, and also to the European Union and also to the United States. And China realized that as long as China holds on these lines on weapon sales and no use of nuclear weapons, there will be no fundamental damage on China-Ukrainian relations. The Ukrainian actors might expect China to do more, but the Ukrainian actors will not be surprised if China refuses to do more than this. And the Chinese decision makers believe in a way that if we hold on to those two basic red lines, the relationship between China and Ukraine before the war was really good, will not be fundamentally reversed after the war if we hold on to those red lines very well. So this is the fundamental reason that why there will be right line being drawn, and why China will decided to follow those right lines, and why China will not do further changes. Because if, say, China aligned more closely with Ukraine, and let's say that China condemn Russia one day, China will not have more, in a way, benefit or more kind of credit for doing that to improve its current strategic position. China and Ukraine relations might improve after the war, but China-EU relationship will not certainly improve by China's rhetoric commitment to Ukraine. So this is, in a way, you may say, the very basic mentality of the Chinese leadership. So what China really wants right now is that China really wants this war to stop soon. And China does not want a collapse of Russia. China wants a stable Russia, because a stable Russia, which means that the border security between Russia and China will be secured. If Russia is facing a regime instability or even an economic collapse, there's too much uncertainties with regard to China-Russia relations, and especially along the long border, which China and Russia used to have a lot of frictions and issues. So I don't think that China wants to see the collapse of Russia, but I don't think China will certainly mind that who is actually in power. But China definitely want a stable Russia. And China wants a friendly relationship with both Ukraine and EU, both within and also after the conflict. So this is why China right now prefers to have a neutralized position, but does not want to be facing too much international pressure to change its current position. So China wants, in a way, like the status of India, which that you have a more or less neutralized position, more closely aligned with the global south, but China will not be singled out, for example, by Western actors to say that why you're not doing anything in this war and why you're not changing your current position. So I think those are the general kind of thing that I can say about the Chinese position and also the motivations behind it. The second large set of questions which I want to address are some general key points, which I can elaborate a little bit more in our discussion time. There are some kind of general points which I think are very contrary to the common sense, you may say, especially in the West. The first point is that hopefully that by what I've elaborated before, that you understand that China's position to Ukraine is actually quite flexible, and it can be adjusted to the changes in the situation and also to the geopolitical environment. The principle on sovereignty and territorial integrity will not change. But on the other hand, that China also believe that the West right now is supporting Ukraine not because of the values or international norms. Because in 2022, I remember this very clearly when you mentioned about that, that why we should respect international norms on sovereignty and territorial integrity. The China decision makers can simply say, well, if the West is truly believe in the principle of territorial integrity, they could have done the same thing in Gaza before 2023 or in Yemen. But when the territorial integrities in those two places are being, in a way, violated, the Western Bloc did not do very much because it's not really related to their geopolitical interest. So I think that China's principle on sovereignty did not really change. But China believes that the Western is supporting Ukraine, not exactly entirely because of the, you may say, the normative alignment on the question of sovereignty. It's more due to geopolitical interest. So this is the first general point. The second general point, which I think is extremely important, and people usually misled on this one, is that I don't think China and Russia are right now in a military and security alliance, not yet. Okay, if China is being cornered more or isolated more, maybe they will enter a more closer alliance. But right now you can say it is in a very aligned partnership, but it's not yet in a military security alliance like in the early 1950s. And actually the Ukrainian war has weakened the relationship between China and Russia, because China sees Russia as an unreliable and unpredictable actor, unlike before. Although that Russia has been engaged in, proxy war or regional conflict previously, but China perceives Russia as capable of managing those conflicts in a manageable way. But after 2022, the Chinese leadership started to worry that Russia is getting out of control and is no longer a reliable partner in the general global sense. But on the other hand, Russia will becoming more reliant on China and want a closer relationship and cooperation with China, and probably want China to align more closely with Russia, without doubt. But I don't think China right now is falling into that, in a way, that persuasion yet. And thirdly, also very importantly, and I think this is why that there has been a misunderstanding there, is that China right now does not have a strong leverage on Russian decision-making. So there's always argument saying that if China want to change Russia's decision-making or change Russia's policies, China can do it. But I don't think China can do it. There's little leverage China can access on Russia politically. And China cannot use economic relationship as a leverage, because this will be simply against China's long-standing policy. China will not use economic tools to change other countries' policy stances towards third parties. So China will use, for example, economic sanctions if this is related to China's own issue. If a country establishes diplomatic relationship with Taiwan, China can use all its economic sanctions that it can do to punish that actor. But in the previous history, you find virtually no evidence to suggest that China will use economic tools to change the country's positions or policy towards a third party. That will be such a fundamental change in China's foreign policy. And I don't think China will do that, right? So even though that China is not following EU on the economic sanctions on Russia, but you can already see that the major Chinese banks are already restricting their trading and also their banking transactions with Russian institutions. This is not due to the pressures from the EU. This is mainly due to the worries from those financial institutions. They kind of still want to do business with the wilder international society. So they're giving up their business related to Russia in exchange for a more stable trading relations and financial relations with the wilder world, so to speak. And fourthly, is that although China has been very anti-NATO, because it is anti-NATO mainly because it believes that NATO is a US-led security institution. However, China is actually quite open to the idea of European community doing self-defense, because China believes that if the European society has this kind of self-defense capacity, this will mean that it will, in a way, limit the security presence of the United States in Europe, which will have a similar implications in Asia. If East Asia partner realize that the Europe need to, in a way, defend itself, and the United States already losing its capacity and credibility for more global and collective security architecture, the East Asian countries might, in a way, figure out their own ways of doing security arrangement, which is something that China always would prefer to get rid of the US presence in the region. So those are the four general points, which I think that worth, in a way, arguing and pointing out, as though, because most of them, in a way, are very contrary to the general, you may say, common sense of some of the popular ideas on the international media. And finally, I want to share with, and this is a question which I've always been asked about, share with you about the Chinese public attitude towards Ukraine. It is not binary. It is not binary. It is not a pro or it is not about pro-Ukraine or pro-Russia. It is not a binary choice. There's a more complicated, there's a layer of different positions and opinions over this kind of spectrum on the Ukrainian issue. So I can list you, at least there are 7 different kind of group of people or different attitude towards Ukraine. Unfortunately, I cannot really tell you that which kind of group will have certain numbers of certain percentage, because there's no public opinion polls specifically on this within China. But my general impression is that and the moderate and, you may say, the middle positions are probably have the largest group. And from either side, you probably have, more polarized and also in a way less kind of people in terms of numbers on the two extreme side. So the first group is what I would call the Russia or Soviet Union fanatics. I don't know whether you have that in Ukraine before 2014, but in China, you certainly have this kind of group of people since the Cold War who has a strange obsession with Soviet Union, and later on that obsession extended into Russia. And since early 2000s, that obsession, or you may say that a worship of Soviet Union and Russia, is closely connected with the personal cult of Putin. So Putin himself does have, in a way, a base of popularity among some groups of people within the Chinese public. And I think that obsession is about the obsession with the military might, with the powerful leadership, at least being perceived for some of the Chinese public towards Russia. But this group has not been a very kind of a strong or representative group within the Chinese public. However, those, because their views are so extreme, so when you see some of the translations and the reports on Chinese public opinion, it's usually the views of these people are being picked up and being translated because they're so radical and extreme. And some of media will find this is the, in a way, the more provocative way of doing the reporting. But actually, they only occupied a very minimum, you may say, faction among the Chinese public. So that is the group one, the people who worship Russia or Soviet Union. The number two group is that the people who support Russia. But the reason why they support Russia is that they see Russia as an anti-US or anti-Western force, and anything that that is challenging the dominant players in the Western-led international system should be supported. And the logic behind it is that the enemy's enemy is our friend, right? So you can see that those same group of people will support Russia, will support, you may say, Hungary, will support any political actors, political individuals who are in a way challenging the existing international system. So those people who support Russia, in a way, there's a large number of them are also Trump supporters within China. They are very, in a way, anti-establishment, anti-US mainstreaming voice. So this is the number two group, like support Russia because it is simply because it is anti-Western, right? And you can say that a lot of pro-Russia voices you can see being reported, some of them are also coming from this group. The third one, which I think is the most difficult one to persuade, is the tricky one here. And they're the most influential one, you may say, that in the decision-making process within China. They're the realist strategist. So they believe that, they see it very clearly. They see this is a Russian invasion. They see this is against international norms, and this is unjust war. But they also see the effect or implications of this war. They see that Russia, by doing that, has been taking a lot of pressures, strategic pressures, of China. Because China was facing the pressures from the United States in East Asia a lot, strategically speaking. So they believe that by having this kind of conflict ongoing, that it actually diverts the US attention and also the West attention towards Europe, which in a way gave China this kind of, you know, strategic space to breathe. So the argument behind it is that Russia took the bullet first in this kind of Western-Eastern confrontation scenario. So for those people who, they might like or hate Russia, it doesn't really matter that much, but they argue that China actually strategically gained from the Russian war. And also China cannot afford a deteriorating or bad relationship with Russia, because if Russia collapses, or if the relationship between Russia and China deteriorated, that means China will put a lot of security resources into the borderland. And it has been a long nightmare of China, is that if you look at the map of China, China literally had border conflict with most of its neighbors. And now with Taiwan in the south, North Korea in the north, and also Russia in the north, China cannot afford to have, in a way, a battlefield, or you may say security dilemmas from all the different front lines. So they would argue that why do we hate or like Russia, despite we may, in a way, find this war as completely unjust. We cannot afford a bad relationship with Russia. We cannot break up the relationship with Russia. We cannot condemn Russia openly. And so they will find a way of maintaining a balanced relationship with Russia and also Ukraine, by extension with Europe at the same time. Those are the people who do not think that China can fundamentally improve its relationship with the United States through the Ukrainian case. So, but they say that we should not ruin our relationship with Europe because of Ukraine. So they would prefer a more detached, limited involvement approach to the Ukrainian war. So the realist strategist, you may say, the very rational, cruel, realist voices within both the Chinese public and also the Chinese leadership. So they're really doing the very rationalist calculations there, even though they understand the normative implications behind it. So this is the third group. The fourth group is the opportunist from the public and also from the leadership. They think that we should take advantages of this war to weaken Russia, to weaken EU, and if we can weaken the United States in this conflict, we should do so as well. And we should leverage the maximum gains for China through this conflict or through this war. So if you talk to the opportunists in the public and also in the leadership, they would say that we should sell weapons to either side. We should not have this kind of weapon ban. They say that the United States are selling weapons or giving weapons away. European Union, South Korea is selling weapons. India right now is considering selling weapons. So why China cannot do the same? So there's a voice there. So they would argue saying that just like the Iran and the Iraq war in 1988, that China literally did not pick side and sell weapons to either side, and also testing China's most recently military technologies. So there's a voice, and also they're saying that if we really have a neutralized position and just to think about maximum our own strategic gains, we should not stop, selling weapons at all. Just either through third parties or directly through to Russian and also to Ukrainian actors at the same time. So this is the number 4 group, the opportunist. The number 5 group is what I call the realist sympathizers. They have sympathy to the Ukrainian cause, but they're also aware of the geopolitical concerns of this kind of conflict behind. And they would argue saying that China should have a pro-Ukrainian position, so slightly changing its current position more towards the Ukrainian side, and sending in more humanitarian assistance, and be more active on conflict mediation, even that we may fail. And China should align itself more closely with the European Union, not necessarily with the United States, but with the European Union on its approach to the Ukrainian war. And this has also have a very strong base within China, because if you look at China's approach to other conflict in other regions, China actually put a lot of emphasis about the regional consensus. So if China is going to step into a conflict in Africa, China will consult with African countries and also African Union about their consensus on this conflict. So if the European Union has a strong consensus about the position towards Ukraine, for those realist sympathizers, they think that we should respect that regional consensus in China's approach to this conflict. And among those people, that there has been a very strong narrative to, in a way, invoke the sympathy for Ukraine. They said that basically Ukraine has been going through the same history as China. If you look at China in the 1930s, in China's struggle against the Japanese aggression is very similar to the Ukrainian history. In 1931, Japan firstly took Manchuria, and the international society basically did nothing despite China's protest and everything. And then 6 years later, in 1937, Japan started a full-scale invasion. So the narrative is very similar. Even the term we use is very similar. We will say that, firstly annex Manchuria and then 1937 full-scale invasion. So those people would use that strong nationalist history as the narrative to have that basis for resonating with the Ukrainian cause, which is also a very strong narrative and also sentimental appealing to the Chinese public. And then you have the 6th group, which is the peace lovers. You may say, they would say that, okay, we are against the war. and we want to stop the war as soon as possible. Well, no, we don't understand why they keep fighting. We want a ceasefire straight away. You may say that the idealistic peace lovers is the group, but this is a very strong group within the general public. So even that they are very sympathetic to the Ukrainian cause, but they probably want a ceasefire straight away. And if they do not have the chances of visiting Ukraine or have close interactions with the Ukrainian public, they cannot really get to the sense that why Ukrainian would choose to fight to the end and will not give up on this fight, right? And very strangely speaking, that even those countries who are actually supporting Ukraine from your perspective, like South Korea, Japan, if you talk there to their public view in terms of this spectrum is very similar to this group within China. Is that they're all like peace lovers. They would always say, yes, we are sympathetic to Ukraine, but we want the war to stop straight away. We want the peace deal to be struck. Even this means that there will be some compromises from the Ukrainian side, but they will end the sufferings for the common people, right? So this is the sixth group, which are the peace lovers, idealistic peace lovers. And the final group is the liberal sympathizers and strong supporters for Ukraine. And this group has gained its voice, I think, after the Ukrainian army has ended the siege of Kiev and the surrounding region, and more so after 2022, the October offensive campaigns to regain the territories. There has been this base for the liberal sympathizers who believe that this is a struggle between the good and the evil. Those groups also have probably a long establishing sentiment of suspicion and hatred against Russia in the past. So they believe this is a struggle between good and evil. And they believe that the liberal society should win, which means Ukraine should win. And we must support Ukraine to a total victory. And China should completely shift its strategic alignment from Russia towards the West, right? So this is the final group, which is the liberal sympathizers and supporters. So those are the 7 different group of people within the public and to a certain extent within the leadership that have different levels of, you may say, pro-Ukrainian or pro-Russian attitude. So this is why I said, I always have been saying this to my Ukrainian colleagues, if you want a public campaign in a way to change or to, in a way, gain more support from China, you should have a very detailed analysis of the specific groups among the Chinese public. It's not a very simple binary kind of position there, okay? My time is running out, so I'm going to say the final point. The final point is that what's from my perspective, if I may, what Ukraine can do to have, in a way, a more closer partnership with Russia. Sorry, not with Russia, with China, and against Russia. First of all, I don't think like a closer alignment with Taiwan would be a wise choice. Because international law, wise speaking, that Taiwan, Ukraine are very different issue, even that from the international legal sense. And by moving closely to Taiwan will definitely provoke China and may have the risk of fundamentally changing China's approach to the Ukrainian war. Sanctions on the Chinese companies, not exactly a good idea either, because in a way that I think that no Chinese companies will specifically want to give up the Ukrainian market and Russian market at the same time. So yes, they might be doing business with Russia, but that also means that at the same time, they can do business with Ukrainian side as well. If you put more sanctions on the Chinese owned enterprises, this means they have to shift their business to Russia, and they cannot recover their relationship with Ukrainian counterpart in any short time. I know this might be a very difficult choice. I mean, you can pick up some kind of Chinese private enterprises to impose your sanction, but I do believe that to impose sanctions on major Chinese energy and also infrastructure companies might not be a very good idea, because Ukraine might need them later. And by putting sanctions on them, even if they want to resume that relationship later on, this will take a very long process. for them to recover, because you're changing the economic relationship into a political one. Even you lift the sanctions later on, they cannot resume their activities straight away. They have to get the approvals from the government, from the foreign ministry, to say whether they can continue the business with Ukraine. So I think that's, in general, is that to understand that China's position is flexible, can be changed. This means that the Ukrainian side need to keep the options very open, and particularly not very being provoked by some of the voices within China, because China is a very big country and we have very diverse views on this conflict. But I think that sometimes both European media and Russian media would want specific voice from China to be heard to the Ukrainian audiences. There's a consensus over some of the Western media and also Russian media. They want the more nationalist, more pro-Russian voice from China to be heard within the Ukrainian audience, to reinforce the image saying that China is pro-Russia, right? But if you really look into the more complex dynamics, I think right now going on in China, you will realize that, you know, the picture is definitely more complicated. And I since 2022 February, and especially after last year, I definitely think that China right now has been shifted to a more neutralized position, which means there's more room to negotiate and also to leverage with the Chinese actors. Right, I will stop here now, and I hope there will be more discussions later. So I will start answering that Power's questions first. Was China thinking the US election one, interpretations of the UN principles, and about the NATO question. So that I think that China can happily accept Ukraine to be part of European Union or part of Europe, because this won't be a difficult like a thing for China. It is up to Ukrainians' own choice. European Union is not a threat to China at all, but China will worry about the implications, for example, of Ukraine joining the NATO and what that means for the East Asian collective security arrangement. That is the part China is worried about. Okay, so for example, if Ukraine is moving fast towards joining the European Union, I don't think China will be unhappy about it. China will simply say that this is a sovereign decision by the Ukrainian government and also the people. The US election, yes, I think everyone right now is waiting to see the result of the US election. China has a very complicated sentiment around the election of Trump, the possibilities of the election of Trump. On the one hand, it will further discredit the United States, and maybe in Europe and globally so. On the other hand, China will realize that if the United States decides to withdraw, not only from Europe, but also from the other regions, China cannot be the free riders of the US-led international system, which means that China will need to at least put more resources into the maintaining of the international system and also order. And China right now is really hesitating to what extent China can be involved in that processes. The double standard accusation, I agree with you. Of course, I think every major power has been really double standard and interpreting the principles to their own advantages in each cases. So there's little I can say about this. I think we have to accept that the major powers and especially the major government are just simply hypocritical. China right now, the position is in a way, I think, strengthening the unity of the West and especially NATO. China's strategic position is not to divide the West, so to speak, but China does not want the West to see it as a threat. That is a more fundamental thing. A unified West won't be an issue for China as long as they do not unify to be against China. I think that is the China's position there. So I hope that's some kind of really quick kind of feedback to those questions. And about the can Ukraine buy weapons from China? No, basically, because China right now banned basically the weapon export both to Russia and to Ukraine. But the Ukrainian side, from my limited knowledge, has been buying supplies and materials can be used in the battlefield from third parties. So say that you can buy traders from Singapore, you can buy it from the Middle East, that traders who bought weapons from China and then later on used in Ukraine. Or in a way, if you have a wild imagination, a European country can buy weapons from China and then ship them to Ukraine. strictly speaking, China might protest it, but there's no way China can enforce any kind of, you may say, punishment on that, right? The nuclear threat, I think China has condemned any kind of forces or explosions being used on the nuclear plant. So rhetoric condemnation is probably what China can do at this stage. This is already the point I said before, that China has a clear red line on non-use of the nuclear threat or weapon. But on the other hand, China has literally no leverage of stopping Russia from really implementing that. So if really Russia want to go ahead, there's little that China can do. Actually, in the strategic gaming, that's stimulation that Russia did on the use of nuclear weapon, there's even part of the plan that it was from China, because Russia worried that China might exploit Russia in this period of weakness to regain some of the territories that China gave to Russia in the Far East. So there are also nuclear weapons and missiles deployed in that region, and in a situation of a potential Chinese aggression, so to speak, from the Russian side. So you can say Russia is very suspicious of China at the same time. So that is for the nuclear threat question. And finally, about reconstruction, I don't think you will need a lot of persuasions for the Chinese companies to come in and do projects in Ukraine. And I have already known many Chinese businessmen who stayed in Ukraine during the war, and who are right now entering Ukraine. So I don't worry about the flows of the Chinese capital into Ukraine for post-war reconstruction or even for business right now. This has always been the feature of the Chinese businessmen, that they seem to be going everywhere and invest everywhere and in any kind of given situation. So what I think that's related to before is that if you want the really major investment in Ukraine, then the Ukrainian government should refrain from imposing sanctions on the Chinese enterprises, which has little impact, to be honest, on the Chinese enterprises themselves, but might have a much longer implications for those companies' participation in Ukrainian reconstruction project in future. Yeah. So those are my quick responses. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lou.
Yeah.
The further questions. Sergey Kushman, philosopher.
Sergey Kushman. Currently, I'm with the Governmental Defense Innovation Cluster, the head of international cooperation. But my question about the two dynamics that I think affect one way or another what happens in perception in China is one is ideological and another is social. I mean, ideological is why I was tracking the resurrection of Confucianism, the synthesis with Marxism, and this kind of new conservatism that is being promoted by the senior leadership of Communist Party. And the second one is obviously social, the whole economic issues, disillusionment of the youth, all the kind of ideas of what it is to be the to live a full life in China in the 21st century. So those ideological and social dynamics, how it influences those groups and perception of the war maybe in the midterm. Thank you.
Alexei Ivanovich.
Thank you, Alexei Ivanovich, philosopher and translator. I have a question regarding Russia. You mentioned a couple of times the scenario of possible turbulence or some collapse of Russia, and said that China is strongly not interested because this will bring, first of all, bring security threats to China. It's curious that many American, European, and especially American politicians would subscribe this view, but for the opposite reason. They would say they are not, they are that against turbulence or collapse of Russia because eventually it would be too good for China. It will make China too strong because if in case of disintegration of Russia, a big part of it, at least its Asian part, will fall under dominance of China. So my question is there a group of politicians or maybe intellectuals in China who consider this situation from this angle, the possible disintegration of Russia as not so much a security threat as a field of opportunities, geopolitical opportunities for China? Thank you.
Thank you. Dmytro Tuzhansky.
Very quick and simple question. What is the future and your, let's say, takeaways? I mean, China takeaways from Belt and Road Initiative. So where is it in this China strategy in Europe and in terms of undermining of unified West? Or it's your quotation.
Thank you so much, Lu. May I ask you to answer these questions?
Yeah, for the first question, what is the implications of the ideological and also social changes in China? I think that will have very kind of long-term fundamental influences, as you mentioned. China has been going through in the past 10 years some of the fundamental, I think, ideological and political changes, which I don't have the space really way to elaborate here. Whether that Chinese societies will turn more, you may say, conservative, and you may say socially restrictive, politically more oppressive, and what might be the implications for that. China, very strangely enough, that they have this kind of, you may say, parallel system of a domestic policies and its foreign policies. When Chinese domestic politics has gone through a period of radicalization, its foreign policies can be in a period of opening up and also flexibility. So when China has going through this, internal turmoil during the Cultural Revolution from 1960s to 1970s, since the late 60s, China already started to reapproach the United States for the normalization between China and the United States, and then with the West. So that's ideological change and the social change you mentioned are true. But the implications for China's foreign policy might be very surprising. Is that China, if China is facing a lot of internal pressures and also the pressures from the democratic changes and also economic slowdown, China will make more compromises, very likely, externally. So which means that we might see, from the outside world, right, you might actually see a much more friendly Chinese foreign policies towards the West and towards Ukraine as well. Not necessarily saying that China will change its current position on the Ukrainian war, but I think that China will not seek a very, in a way, aggressive policy or confrontational policies, and will seem to try to, in a way, please everyone, and also its key international partners in the game. So I think that my kind of key take is that if these trends are continuing, you can see a softening of China's foreign policy rather than Chinese foreign policies being more aggressive and assertive. So that's number one. Number two, yes, there are a sizable number of people who would argue that we want to see the collapse of Russia, and we want to take back the territories that we have lost to Russia, and we want to gain more influences in, say, the Central Asia, and even more into the ex-Soviet Union states. There's argument there. And strangely enough, those people are actually, many of those people who are having this really strong view against Russia, actually the Russian experts, those people who have studied Russia for a very long time. So there's a very interesting phenomenon there. In China, if you work on the China-US relations for a very long time, usually those scholars are more, in a way, moderate and liberal. Those people that work with Russia for a very long time seem to have developed their suspicion and very aggressive attitude towards Russia. So that the group of people which you mentioned, I think that those are the people who actually knows Russia quite well. And they know that Russia will have done the same thing against China if China is being, in a way, put into a very similar situation. So they simply argue that China should do the same. The problem is that Russia is fully aware of the existence of those group of people and its opinion. This is why that Russia is fully prepared for any of these kind of potential moves that China will be planning if there is any kind of collapse or turbulences within Russia. So the Chinese government essentially worry about, Chinese government does not really care whether there's a democratic transition in Russia, why they say you replace Putin with some more liberal figures who will make a peace deal with Ukraine. This will not concern China that much. China wants a stable Russia, despite who is in power, what kind of political regime it is. But China worried that right now, if Putin is out, China worried that, first of all, if there's no collapse of Russia, there might be even more aggressive and nationalist figure to replace Putin. There's that possibility China is worried about, which means that Russia will become even more unpredictable. And whether that China and Russia can maintain the current relationship, relatively friendly one, along the border will be questionable if a more nationalist Russian leader is in power, right? So that is the worry. The second worry is, as I mentioned, about whether there will be this power vacuum and there's no strong man in Russia. Russia will collapse economically, socially, politically. And China will note, I think right now the Chinese government, despite the lobbying from those Russian experts, China will not seek this as the advantage to, in a way, have territorial gains from Russia. China will probably seek to weaken Russia and will be happily to see Russia being more reliant on China. But China will not want to provoke or corner Russia to the extent that it will consider China as its potential enemy. Because if you look at the China-Russia history, there's a long-standing history of territorial dispute, fight, conflict going on. And for a very long period of time in history, probably more time compared to the time of peace, China has always considered Russia as enemy and as a threat from the north. So this is why that China think that if China is very strongly, China can right now already start to take more advantages, say in Central Asia and in other spheres of influence from Russia. But China certainly realized that even any move right now, non-territorial related, are already enough to provoke Russian decision makers to take actions against against Chinese actors. And this might have a long-term implications for China-Russia relationship, which Chinese actors cannot afford. So there's a voice there, but I don't think they will take dominance. I don't think they will be the ones that will shape Chinese decisions anytime soon. Yeah, but there's a nationalist voice there. So it's, in a way, it's very strange because for the Chinese top leadership, they never will see that collapse of Russia will be beneficial to China, contrary to the view of the, United States and all that. And finally, is the BRI. The BRI, people have a great misunderstanding of the BRI, saying that, okay, this is the initiative for China to expand its global influence to counter, the West-dominated international system. BRI came out, and when President Xi announced BRI, he specifically chose to announce it in Central Asia because Chinese investment was facing a lot of difficulties and resistance there from the Russian pressure. BRI firstly came out and being announced as Chinese investment in Central Asia was facing Russian resistance. So you can see how ironically that came out in a way as a way of countering Russian influence in Central Asia and in a way to find another strategic space for the Chinese investors and also for the Chinese geopolitical gains. But then later on it's being perceived as a more, initiative to challenge the Western dominated system. So my future of the BRI is that I think that throughout, the pouring of the money and the infrastructure project in the past 10 years or so, this trend of Chinese companies going abroad will continue. So even, during COVID right now, after COVID, even with the economic slowdown, you can see the outflow of the Chinese capitals. But I think the Chinese companies right now are learning to be more smart about this investment. It used to be less concerned about the political risk, about the social risk, about environmental risk, but now you can see the investment are being fully more aware of those issues. So this is why I say that even though China will not impose economic sanctions on certain countries that are facing Western sanctions, the Chinese economic stakeholders or business sectors, they will make their own rationalist choice. If a country is facing a lot of international sanction, the Chinese company realized that if we're continue to do business with this country or with this actor, we're losing the business with the larger international market. Some of them, if they're small enough, they will make the choice. They will become their niche. There will be Chinese companies who are right now saying that we will only do business with the Russian market, which is already big enough for our size of the company. But for all the major Chinese investors who have their global maps, who are more connected with the BRI, the Western sanctions are having an impact on them because they're forcing them to make a choice. So I think that BRI will continue, Chinese investment abroad will continue, but in a way that the investment will be shaped by the directions of the Western injunctions, because they will simply choose where Chinese companies can have the largest impact and also revenue returns. So they will be up for the international market. Yeah. So those are my quick responses.
Thank you so much, dearly. I'm afraid the time is running out. Is there any final point you want to make?
Final point is that I wish to continue, and I also will take the view that saying that China will need a more active mediation strategy, which I believe that is something that I'm currently working on with a lot of stakeholders involved, is that we're trying to frame a better, acceptable, feasible strategy for China to engage on the Ukrainian war. And the final note is that despite there's a little attention to that, I think there's an increase of the public exchanges between China and Ukraine. While I was in Kharkiv last year, in July, I was really surprised to learn that the Chinese student registered in Kharkiv University during the war actually increased in comparison before the war. This really surprised me a lot. I mean, I know there's Chinese students there, but it did not really strike me that much to say that there will be more Chinese students and also businessmen coming to Ukraine, even during the war. How are we going to maximize their presence in Ukraine, and how those people can become, a part of the larger networks for the public diplomacy between China and Ukraine, I think are the directions that which we think give some more serious thought. Okay.
Thank you so much, Lu. In the name of my colleagues, let me just thank you cordially, and we hope very much to see you here in June. We'll keep in touch, and probably we'll have a better discussion, have it offline rather than online. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Have a nice weekend. Thank you.
Thank you for being here, and look forward to seeing you in Ukraine.